Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week as I move towards the sermon that I will be preaching to my congregation, and then move away from that and move into actually writing and preparing that sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. I think I just kind of repeated myself. The second reason that I do these is just to allow you, the viewer who have come across this video for whatever reasons brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned gospel or text, I should say, for the week. And I make that switch because this weekend I'm doing things a little out of the ordinary. This particular Sunday, which is January 29th, 2017, the fourth Sunday after Epiphany, I am actually preaching out of the Old Testament lesson this week. I usually do the gospel. If you are a regular viewer, you know that the gospel for this week is out of Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, also known as Beatitudes. But I decided not to preach on that this week because we recently had Luke's version of that just last fall, so not very long ago. And in reviewing the other lessons assigned in the lectionary for the week, I decided to go with the Old Testament reading. So the I want to say gospel. I just want to, don't I? The lesson that I will be preaching out of this week it comes from the Old Testament prophet of Micah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. So that is what I will be preaching on. So I'm going to go ahead and read through it, and then we'll talk about it, kind of the way things go. So hear what the Lord says. Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? In what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I have brought you up from the land of Egypt, and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I set before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam son of Beor answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. Okay, I'm going to pause for just a second because there's something that I think is funny. Here's this Old Testament place. I don't really know too much about it. I just pronounced it Shittim, or Shittim, I think is what some scholars say is the correct pronunciation. It's spelled Shittim, and I think that's funny. But anyway, I digress, and let's move on. With what shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. All right, so that's the reading. There's a couple of different things going on here. First, some background on Micah. Now, admittedly, I'm not the greatest authority on Old Testament prophets, particularly the minor prophets, of which Micah is one of them, that were called the minor prophets because they're quite short, they're quite brief, and they're found towards the end of the Old Testament, which is kind of how we present them. But Micah was a prophet that was active in the kingdom of Judah. He was from the area not too far away from Jerusalem. And it's thought that his active time period was probably late 8th century BCE, so like in the 700s BCE, which is right about the time that the Assyrian Empire came in and took over Samaria in the north, and that's kind of evidenced within some of the overarching writing of the book of Micah. We hear about the Assyrians fairly regularly. There's one little hint toward the Babylonians as well, although the Babylonian exile and conquering will come a couple hundred years later. And that will get down to the south in Judah, but kind of overarching what's going on is we hear some back and forth talking about the idea that God will redeem his people, that God will call them back out of exile, God will bless them once again, which is something that we continue to see throughout the history of the Old Testament. We see it again in the New Testament, that God continuously saves his people. raises the question, who are God's people? And that's open to interpretation by everyone, but we see that continuing pattern, and that's on display here in this reading. Now, there's a couple of different things happening in this. I've heard different scholars talk about this as God is raising a lawsuit against His people, and we hear, "Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord. He has controversy with His people. He will contend with Israel." So God is apparently bringing some issue with the people through the prophet. We do hear this fairly regularly. But what's interesting here is that God kind of talks about, or God defends God's self, if that's necessary, against the weariness of the people. Even though God has done nothing but show mercy to the people, salvation to the people over and over and over again. The covenant made all the way back with Abraham, though it's not referenced here, is that I will make of you a great nation, and from your descendants I will bless all nations, or all nations will be blessed through you. So this becomes the nation of Israel, or the nation of the Jewish people. Of the nation of Judah, if you want to call it that. But there's been an ongoing thing, and God talks about, I delivered you from Egypt, I brought you out of the house of slavery. There's some references to a Moabite king, and then this Balaam son of Beor, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal. Admittedly, again, Old Testament, not always my strong suit. So what those are referencing, without spending a lot of time looking it up, I can't tell you off the top of my head. But God is referencing these different times that He has shown mercy and salvation to the people, that He's brought them out and saved them from something. And Egypt is the big example. Often what I've heard is that the Exodus from Egypt, the Ten Commandments, whatever you want, not the Ten Commandments, the 10 plagues, Passover, all of that, that's the basis. That's really the beginning for the Jewish culture. Even perhaps more important than the patriarchs that we hear about in Genesis. So that's going on. And then, but once that's happened and that's been referenced, then things kind of switch gears, and it seems to be the voice of the people echoing questions that I think a lot of times many of us wrestle with, is, with what shall I come before the Lord? How shall I bow before God on high? And this is talking about the idea of sacrifice. Now, in the Old Testament, blood sacrifice, animal sacrifice, burnt sacrifice, etc., 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 were important. That's how the people atoned for their sins and showed thankfulness to God for the blessings that God gave. But they're asking the question, what's enough? And what I like about it, or what, maybe not to say that I like it, but what seems quite fitting is it's an increasing scale. Shall I bring before you a burnt offering with a calf a year old? Now that in itself is a pretty big offering. But then it grows exponentially. Shall I bring 1,000 rams before you, or 10,000 rivers of oil, which is tons and tons and tons of stuff? Should I go even farther? Should I offer my firstborn to you, which at the time was happening? That's not, now we think of that as barbaric, but at the time it happened. So it wasn't out of the ordinary, even if it might have been horrible. But it's an increasing thing. And then we hear a switchback, and it seems to be in the voice of the prophet who is speaking for God now in this last part. And this is perhaps one of the most well-known verses of the Old Testament. A lot of times you'll see it printed somewhere, or a lot of times people seem to have tattoos of it or whatever. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. It's actually, he has told you, man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Now the word require, not the greatest translation. Now keep in mind, we're going all the way back to Hebrew, and this is a very, very old language that's difficult because their vocabulary was drastically smaller than what we have in English, and so words were very fluid. But a better translation of that, rather than what does God require of you, is what is the Lord seeking from you? And then we hear do justice. Well, what is justice? That's a great question. That's a fun Hebrew word. That word is mishpat. Here in the Lutheran circle, that sounds like something we would serve at a potluck. What are we having? We're having mishpat. Mishpatluck. and that may be how I get into this sermon. I'm not sure yet, but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. As I think a lot about that, this brings up the idea of discipleship, which is something that's been quite prominent within our texts, our gospel text in recent weeks. Seems to be something fitting for my congregation, so that's probably the direction I'm going to go. It seems to be discipleship. And what does it mean to be a follower of God? What is God asking of us? And it's not sacrifices. It's not an increasing amount, because there's never enough that will really that will buy us into God's good graces. But that we seek, that we do justice. Well, what does that mean? That we do that which is just, that we do that which is good for those around us, that we do not do that which is self-serving, that we do not do that which is that seeks our own interest, but we do that which serves others. Then that we love kindness. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory. And that we walk humbly with God. Well, what does it mean to walk humbly with God? I think being humble before God is being honest about our shortcomings, our failings, to recognize that God is God and I am not, to take serious the first commandment, that you shall have no other gods before me. That's God speaking, and that means us. We don't get put on the pedestal, even though we're really good at that pride thing. The final point that I want to bring up, the thing that I find very interesting about this, is that the way it ends, walk humbly with your God. And in conversation with some other pastors this week, I was reminded of something important that comes to us. That sounds very similar to the Ten Commandments, which if we go back to that, of course, you shall do this, you shall not do this. It's kind of rules, and we know that we never manage to do them. We cannot do them perfectly. We cannot live up to them. And yet, before we get into those rules in the Ten Commandments of this is what you are to do and this is what you are not to do, we are reminded, I am the Lord your God. And when God says this, I don't think this is God saying, you claim me as your God. I think this is God saying, I am your God. I claim you as my people. And this is an important aspect as we consider the gospel. The gospel is never about what we do or say or think or don't do or say or think. It's not a checklist that we stay on the good side of to make sure that we're good. The gospel is always about what God has done and what God has said about us. God claims us, and his love for us is the catalyst for that. Because God loves us so much, he claims us as his people. And yeah, so that's kind of where I'm going with this. I'm still doing some more work with it, but if you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, share those down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week. We'll catch you next time.